Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the final event in the spring 2024 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. Thank you to my co-organizers, Francesca Royster, Antonia Randolph, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and from a distance, Eric Weisbard. You can find the full schedule of the IASPM US website under the Journal tab, and previous recorded sessions of the Popular Music Books in Process series are archived on Eric's YouTube channel. Also, we're in the process of working on a new call for proposals for the fall of 2024, spring of 2025 Popular Music Books in Process season, so please look out for that. Today, we're very excited to have Ann Powers here in conversation with Jody Rosen and our own Carl Wilson to discuss her very soon to be released
I'm just
book,
listening, honey.
Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell.
I'm just listening.
For more than 30 years, Ann Powers has been a professional music writer since her teen days, covering punk and new wave in Seattle, through a career that has included jobs at the Village Voice, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and National Public Radio, where she is currently a critic and correspondent. She has published 5 books as author or editor, including Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, published in 2017, and the new Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell, which is coming out soon. She co-founded NPR's Turning the Tables series, dedicated to recentering the popular music canon on undersung figures, including women. She lives in Nashville with her husband, Eric Weisbard. Jody Rosen is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and the author of Two Wheels Good, The History and Mystery of the Bicycle. His writing on music, culture, and politics has appeared in The New Yorker, New York, Slate, and The Nation, among other publications. A new book, Wildest Dreams, Taylor Swift's 21st Century, is forthcoming from Viking Press in 2026 or so. Carl Wilson is the music critic for Slate and wrote the acclaimed book, Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste. He's a Toronto-based freelance writer and editor who's also published in Book Forum, Billboard, the New York Times, and many other venues. Carl has a book in process about the late songwriter and poet David Berman for W.W. Norton, and he recently launched his own newsletter of reviews and reflections called Critic. It's a Waiting for Godot reference. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Antonia Randolph will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Antonia will find them there at the end of the discussion. And also feel free to post comments throughout the conversation. So now I will turn things over to Ann, Jody, and Carl.
Thanks so much, Kim. I guess I'm going first. I want to say how much a pleasure it is to round out the season of the series with this book that we've all been awaiting for a long time, and that has already been extremely influential on my own thinking about writing biography and about music writing in general. So I have the first question. Jody and I are going to go back and forth. Apologies for the way I look. I'm on an iPad today because I spilled water on my laptop over the weekend. So Ann, approaching a subject like Joni Mitchell, you had to be super aware of all of the writing and conversation that had gone before you over the decades. Can you talk a little bit about how that
I have my license. You know, drive if you
your
want to listen to
approach?
that.
Could everybody mute, please? Could you talk a little bit about how that influenced your idea about what kind of book this should be and the stages that you went through finding a form and a voice for this book over the years you spent working on it?
Well, I feel we should bear the device or expose the gods or whatever we're doing to say. So Jody and Carl, I invited them to do this because we have a group text, and they were among the very first people who read any of this book, actually. And so they know better than anybody that it's really changed an enormous amount since I started writing it 8 years ago or so. Yeah, well, I struggled a lot to find the form. I struggled a lot with the anxiety of influence, honestly, and feeling particularly like I wasn't sure if I could fulfill the role of a biographer, and uncertain, also, honestly, being somewhat hostile to the idea of conventional biography, but hostile out of perhaps a defensiveness as well. And there have been many great books written about Joni, and I read them all, and each one brought something different to my process, you know. One thing I really tried to do was be in dialogue with that literature in a way that was a little different maybe than a conventional academic book, and that I wasn't just citing, I shouldn't say just, but I wasn't simply citing texts and responding in a kind of a, you know, intellectual way, but I was actually, you know, trying to express my anxieties about, like, how does this fit in, and maybe gently critique some of the work that's come before, or not so gently, but also always give it credit too, because I am happy to be on that bookshelf with all the other stuff. But as far as the form, you know, I started in a far more experimental mode than where I ended up, but I hope the sort of vestiges of the experimentation that I did remain in the text. So like what you two saw, there was, I don't know, there were semi-fictional passages, there were like all these different quotes and references and just like going all over the place, much more lyric essay than it finally ended up. Carl, you didn't like that answer?
Sorry.
Is that why you're putting your
I'm
hand? Go away.
In order to mute myself, I have to put my hand in front of the iPad.
That's gonna give me a complex. Anyway.
Okay, I unmuted and it's my turn. So
you can elaborate on the past question too, though, if you have anything to say about form, or since we're, you know.
Okay, or Carl, if you want to jump in and follow up and really grill, man, feel free. But okay, so you have a wonderful chapter in the book, which am I wrong or right in thinking that the chapter about childhood was also a pop conference paper at one point? Am I right about that?
It was, yeah, part of it was. Yes, part of it was. Yes.
So you have a chapter about childhood, which does some very elegant biographical stuff, despite your ambivalence about biography. You know, discussing Mitchell's childhood in Saskatchewan, her relationship with her parents, her mother in particular, and the kind of theme of flight or escape that is a big part of her work, would become a big part of her work. And you also spiral out to discuss what you call the cult of the child in 60s, 70s counterculture, and you know, among singer-songwriters of the period, an argument which is really interesting and pulls in all kinds of stuff about self-help culture and hippie pastoralism. Very fascinating stuff. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Joni Mitchell's childhood, or rather, to use your framing, about Roberta Jones' childhood and the character called Joni Mitchell, who had her origins in that period.
Yeah, no, thanks for making a distinction there. So I talk about how Joni created the character who I call Roberta Jones, the child that we know through her songs. I was interested in the relationship between what I could know of her biography, of her actual childhood. And of course, there are such limits, and anyone here, and I don't know, I can't see everybody in the room, but anyone here who is a biographer knows there are serious limits around how much you can understand, especially about your subject's childhood, I think, because it's just obscured by the mists of time and memory. And if you talk to people about the childhood of a famous person, they bring so much, you know, aura to the conversation, and it's just hard to know. So I was interested in thinking about how Joni had like used her own childhood as a frame, especially and through which she presented herself, especially in the early material, but it really runs through all of her songs. She's always going back to Canada, back to the prairie, back to those settings. So I wanted to really kind of talk about Roberta Joan, that's her given name, as an actual person, but also as a character. So that was a goal I had for that section. Should I say more?
Jody, are there
I-
other things about the child theme that you wanted to get
Yeah,
into?
well, maybe you could say a bit about the kind of that cult of childhood stuff, just because I found
Yeah.
it so. Unless you don't want to, I just found that
No.
particularly
I'd love
rich
to.
and fascinating.
Yeah, no, so it, I write about, I'm looking at it. The chapter is called Childish Things. And, I write about what I know of her experiences growing up, but then I also want to put her into the scene where all these other singer-songwriters and writers in general, filmmakers, etc., are thinking about childhood as both an ideal and as the obvious origin point of their own stories. And as singer-songwriter cohort, as that singer-songwriter cohort came into view, they often came into view telling these stories of their own childhood. I mean, none more notoriously or famously than Jackson Browne, who had numerous songs, I Am a Child in These Hills, etc. So many child songs, but also obviously Neil Young has Sugar Mountain, to which Joni responds with Circle Game. He also had I Am a Child. So, all of these songs, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, take the paternal aspect and say, teach your children. But again, even the sound of that song invokes childhood in a way. And even thinking musically, it's interesting to think of Joni's early songs, especially a song like Circle Game, which is almost designed for children to sing, And I think that I wanted to throw light on this to ask the question, why do we care about the childhood of the people, of the subjects we address, in biography? Like, why does the childhood matter? And the reason why the childhood stories matter to us is because of this frame of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy that we put around so much, and I think we are all trained and raised and therapized to think, well, the true answers to the character of this person or the artistry of this person are there in the childhood. So I wanted to throw light on that. And I'm obsessed with self-help. And I just really wanted to also remind everyone that the singer-songwriter phenomenon of the late 60s happened in tandem with this really big rise in therapy and self-help and Gestalt and all of these different ways in which people were going within. I do that in a few different chapters, but particularly in terms of so many people having encounters with their inner child, and thinking about how that is reflected in the music, especially of this cohort. I think more so I am the chapter with Jimi Hendrix though, so make of that what you will. But I wanted to also, and that's the part I presented at the pop conference, I wanted to talk about how this particular idealized version of childhood was really only available in some ways to white performers, and that Black performers and non-white performers, they also sometimes presented idealized visions of childhood, but just even the way, whatever their childhood actually was, even the way the childhood of a non-white person was sort of understood at that time. Oh my God, did you guys hear that? There was like a huge thunderclap, sorry. I guess they don't like what I'm saying. The gods don't like what I'm saying. Anyway, so I talk about that in relation to Bill Withers and other artists of that time, Stevie Wonder, whose childhood was portrayed differently in the media and who responded to the question of what matters about childhood in such a different way in their music.
Yeah, fantastic. It's funny, and I don't know if I've ever told you this, but my first conscious memory of ever encountering anything to do with Joni Mitchell was in elementary school when I had a teacher who played the acoustic guitar and had us sing songs, and we sang Circle Game.
There you go. See, it's like it's
grade one.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think reckonings with the counterculture now often address this subject of how there was a sort of an impulse to infantilize or idealize, I don't know. I think it always goes back to that. I also had a fifth grade teacher who had us sing songs with the acoustic guitar, but I don't think we did circle game though. But I know she played Knights in White Satin. That's pretty random, but that's a whole other story. She only lasted a year though.
Then had to hit the road again.
Exactly.
One of the things I love about the childhood chapter is that it's one of a lot of places in the book that we see Joni as kind of a cultural barometer, and really the ways that her life tracked kind of changes that the culture was going through.
Yeah.
But there's kind of this constant tension in the book between that sort of insiderness and like centrality of her and an outsiderness. And
Yes.
I'm gonna approach that from a selfish point of view and talk a little bit about her Canadianness.
Yeah.
And we talk about positionality a lot in this series. So first, how dare you, as an American writer, deal with this
Dude, I'm
essentially
from the Pacific
Canadian
Northwest.
figure?
I'm practically Canadian. You know that. Some of my best
But
friends are
more
Canadian.
seriously, like what in the course of working through this, how did you come to see that Canadianness as a function of what sort of formed her voice and her role in kind of moving into an American popular culture in that way? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, well, one thing that happens when you publish a book, and many people in this room today know this, is that you start immediately thinking about all the things you couldn't include for various reasons or didn't include. So I had in my early, more experimental draft, I had a chapter, proposed chapter that was going to be about Joni's Canadian voice, and particularly her Canadian accents, and how I think having a Canadian accent distinguishes her in a lot of ways from her cohort. Not entirely, obviously we have Neil Young there, but Neil Young is sort of has a Canadian accent by way of Mars or something. I mean, he has such an odd timbre to his voice. But I really do think that matters, like in terms of, and when she starts to find her own voice and moves beyond the kind of Joan Baezisms of her early years, that her conversational voice is always firmly Canadian, I think. And I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what other people think about this. I think one thing that did, I don't know, I was gonna say something, but now I don't know if I believe it. So I was thinking maybe for a Canadian, there was a different relationship between African-American music and kind of your own personal experience, her own personal experience. I don't know if this is true, but there's a way in which her Canadianness sort of like puts her outside that circle of indebtedness and dialogue with African-American artists. But I came in thinking that, but ultimately I think I'm going to say I do not believe that anymore. And obviously that became the center of the Art Nouveau stuff that I write about, and work building on the work of Miles Greer and others. So I don't know about that, but I do think there is a way in which her Canadianness, she owns her Canadianness as a way out, as a constant kind of exit road back, way to get out of the American machine that she has very mixed feelings about. So it provides a kind of distance for her. I think that is useful. And, we see that off and on in different periods. It's less pronounced. I don't think it's really there in the 80s so much, but definitely from the 60s to the 70s, she has that. It's interesting in the 80s that she becomes extremely enamored of English musicians and makes alliances with Peter Gabriel and other English musicians, and that is another kind of turn that she goes farther than a lot of her peers do to do that. And maybe that's just another way of her constantly stepping back and being out of remove from what she saw, and perhaps still sees as, the corrupting elements of California the music industry.
Yeah, that's so interesting. One, we'll get into this further, but I would say that there's a difference in not, the influence is still there because it's pervasive through North American music, but the racial imaginary that
Mhm.
someone comes along with is, I think, really radically different than what somebody growing up in the US has. And the other thing I think is, like, you talk in really rich ways about the particularity of her relationship, however brief, with Leonard Cohen
Yes.
as one of the only sort of peers that she recognized. And, both of them and that whole sort of mode of lyrical, poetic songwriting in
Yeah.
that sort of late 60s period is really key to, like, a way that Canadian culture came to see itself, and as what Canada came to see as its voice in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I also want to say and I didn't really develop this, so this is rich for someone else to write about, the unsung influence of Ian and Sylvia and Gordon Lightfoot on her too. And she and Gordon Lightfoot are friends, were friends, R.I.P. Gordo. And I think that side of Joni, the side of Joni that's like interested in the West and interested in kind of the epic storytelling, which plays out in very slanted ways in her work. It's not necessarily the center of the work, but I think she came up with this other idea of storytelling that's rooted with those titans of Canadian folk. And of course, it's a complicated subject, and we could spend a whole session, but we have to talk about Buffy Sainte-Marie, because Buffy Sainte-Marie was such a huge influence on Joni early on, and mentor for Joni, and helped get the word out about her. So I think, but there's a lot. That's a complicated subject, but definitely
It's become so, yeah.
Yeah, but definitely was a huge influence on her. So
Yeah, and you talk, about the role of sort of an indigenous figure and a relationship, however projected, to
right.
indigenous culture in her work, and that's very much of the particular West that she comes from.
Yeah, totally. And that was foundational for her in a way that obviously encounters with African American people were not as much, although of course she does have that song, that later song, Harlem and Havana, where she talks about this troupe that came through her town. So it's not like she was completely unaware, but yeah, I think she romanticizes the Indigenous and First Nations culture. She also has done a lot to benefit, she has done a lot of charity work and activist work in that realm, but she absolutely undeniable that she romanticizes Indigenous people.
Jody, this might be a place for you to take over.
Yeah. Right. So you mentioned it. We're talking around it. You mentioned Art Nouveau and Joni's exploration, shall we say, of blackface masquerade there. And shout out Miles Greer, as you said, who's here. But also, this music, I'm thinking of music, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, and Mingus, of course, was controversial because it was her experiment with jazz fusion. So, that's a really fascinating part of your book, and a really fascinating passage in Joni's career. So maybe you can talk about that a bit. And then also, that raises the question of your own perilous journey as a pop critic into arguably jazz critic territory, which of course is fraught, as we well know, any of us who've tried to cross that particular border in any way. So you go wherever you want with this topic.
Okay, well,
there's a lot in it.
Yeah. Well, I do have a chapter called For Art's Sake, and I have to give credit not only to Miles, but to my readers for that chapter, Daphne Brooks, Sonnet Rittman, and Gail Wald, because that was a very hard chapter to write. I felt very aware of other voices and other eyes on me while I was writing about that period in Joni's life and her decisions to to create this and then sustain this character, which, by the way, interestingly, after the galleys of the book were out, so I'm not saying taking any responsibility or whatever, but the images for the reissue of Don Juan that they're doing archival reissues came out, and she is not using she's not using the Art Nouveau image anymore. She's actually using an image for the cover of that album that's from the Dog Eat Dog sessions, with her with a wolf or a wolf-like dog. Anyway, interesting. She had before that, she had never made a comment or renounced Art Nouveau in any way. So yeah, I mean, I think we have what I argue in the Art Nouveau chapter. I do a little bit of work of like, why did she think this was okay? Where did it come from? What was the context? What was going on around her? But ultimately, why I wanted to say, and in dialogue with Miles, because I actually have a long dialogue with Miles in the book. Yeah, I think what I wanted to say was, we can explain, contextualize, look for origins, but the main thing we need to say is like, this is not okay. And why was it okay? Why did so many people around her not call her out on it? And I still find that a fascinating question. I will say I wasn't necessarily courageous enough to ask people that question directly though. So I think if I fell down on anything, it was that, but it's a hard question to ask. And it's one we can ask about so much that happened in that era in particular. I think let's connect this to jazz fusion in general. So I completely got obsessed with that period and that music, and I wrote this insanely long chapter. It was originally 27,000 words or something, which included the Art Nouveau section that became its own chapter, but still, it was really long. And mostly, I wanted to kind of reclaim the term jazz fusion and building on the work of Kevin Velez, whose book Birds of Fire is so great, and other scholars. And I should say, I'm going to backtrack and say, I think, Eric Lott and Kevin Velez's writing on Art Nouveau is also really essential reading, even if I do have some differences with them. I mean, very important to my way of thinking and very insightful, and I encourage everyone to read it. But anyway, so I got really deep into that stuff, and I just kind of wanted to think about what was defined as jazz fusion and what wasn't. And I love the way that Kevin Velez uses the phrase "the broken middle" to think about fusion and how it exists in this space that is always becoming, but never quite is, never solidifies. And I feel like that was the experience of the people who were making it, and in interviewing people like Randy Brecker, Larry Carlton, or Erto Moreira, Flora Purim, and reading a ton of archival stuff. That's what I ultimately walked away from in that period, was that the kind of instability of terms and definitions during that time, which was so fruitful, but also led to all kinds of problems, including the problem of racism imprinting itself on these definitions and excluding certain people. Even I found, like, for example, the outrage of white critics to be different than the outrage of some Black critics, or notably Amiri Baraka, about jazz fusion. I felt like the outrage of white critics weirdly caused them to ignore the non-white people who were involved with jazz fusion, which I found was interesting, telling perhaps. People see and hear what they want to see and hear. I also wanted to make the point, and I do this in a section called The Sound of Money, that the music she was making during that time and her particular kind of jazz fusion, and it was very much in line with, but also satirizing the kind of slick LA, ELLAY 70s lifestyle. And I talk about Free Man in Paris as the ultimate, example of that. And I have to give credit to my friend and editor, Jacob Gans, because that was a section that my book editor wanted to cut out. She thought I went on too long, and he's like, no, that's fundamental. So I'm very glad that's in there, talking about she identifies this character, the free man who is desperate to escape from the very thing that generated his existence, and that he ultimately cannot escape. And thinking about this music in terms of money making and status, and you know, just how these, especially Hissing of Summer Lawns, is so much the sound of money in the 70s also. Here comes Carl's hand. Carl's hand is the hand of God.
And while you were talking about that, I was just thinking about, do you think that we're in a kind of renewed moment of fusion right now? It's, you know, fusion across hip hop and other things as well. But, you know, thinking of the jazz scene in London and the things that come over, and the LA scene with Kamasi Washington and all of these things, like I wonder if you compare those moments in that way, what you think about.
Yeah, no, I totally do. And that's why I'm desperate to do a jazz fusion podcast, if anyone will have me. So I'm just putting that out there in the universe constantly. I feel like we should do you know, and really like somebody needs to explore these terms and the history and the historical connections. I mean, look, we just did, this is more smooth jazz, but we just did a Bob James Tiny Desk that was like super popular and hyped. So, you know, it's definitely back. Andre 3000 playing his flute everywhere, but I also think we have a better awareness, and I try to do this some in the book, but a better awareness of, you know, different lineages. So spiritual jazz, for example, is, I think, much more kind of part of the mass media, or at least social media, lingua franca now. And you know, elements of fusion that were maybe marginalized a bit, not as center, not as mainstream, are coming back, you know. But I also argue in the book, and I think this stands true today, that, you know, the way we classify an artist like Stevie Wonder, for example, you know, I don't know, why is he never, I guess he wasn't playing jazz technically, whatever, but, you know, why is he so rarely placed in dialogue with Joni and with others like that? So, and I'm sure if we thought for like 3 seconds, we could think of people like that today, but, you know, maybe even, I don't know, Andre had to pick up that flute for us to think of him in a different way, you know. So this is just my kind of like cry against the way we categorize things. We're always saying we should trouble our categories. But yeah, it's totally back. It's totally back.
That Andre album is like really his secret life of plants, right?
Yeah, exactly. It totally is. But, you know, I also want to say a huge part of jazz fusion, and this is a section in the book that I was sad got cut down because I wrote that chapter too long, but is Latin music and Brazilian music in particular, and Caribbean music and island music in general. And that is something that we're hearing so much in pop today, that and just in music in general today. And it's not an accident that Carlos Nino is the guy who's like the cult figure in LA or whatever. It's, you know, I feel like that is never talked about. Usually people talk about jazz fusion, they're talking about jazz rock, and they're talking about Weather Report, and they're talking about, maybe they're talking about Blood, Sweat and Tears or whatever, but so much of that music from the get-go, especially the stuff coming out of New York, was just as Puerto Rican and, you know, Dominican and every Haitian as it was anything else. And that's another reason also why it's important to acknowledge Don Elias's importance in Joni's music during that time, even if he's sort of a difficult figure to talk about now.
Jody, anything else on that before we move to anything else? Okay.
Sorry, forgot to unmute. Yeah, no, Carl, you rock on. Go ahead.
Okay.
I want to say everybody should check out this record by the Brecker brothers, their early band Dreams, by the way. If you're curious to find some awesome vintage jazz fusion, I highly recommend that band Dreams. They're so, oh my gosh, they're just so beautifully bell-bottom pants, early 70s. Like, oh, I love it. So good.
Well, from fusion, when moving forward chronologically, we get into the interestingly fraught question of the 80s synth years.
Yeah.
I'm particularly I'm thinking about the way that, in biographies really often books lose a lot of momentum and focus when they get into the later years of the artist, sort of what we might say is sort of after their peak, and certainly after the kind of excitement of the rise and the sort of plateau period. But you really go deep into those later albums that have really been dismissed a lot over the years. And
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk about what you found to be exciting there, and the ways it made you think about sort of telling the story of a still living artist who, you deal with the question of, how am I going to talk about places where the things became maybe rockier,
Right.
and all of that kind of question.
Right. Well, yeah, that was something that developed during the writing of the book. Shout out to those who are also writing about this period. I think Matthew Jones is out there. I think you're working on something from this period. And also Annie Zaleski wrote a great piece about Joni's 80s work in The Guardian. I just like fell in love with Larry and Joni as a unit, Larry Klein and Joni. I just love their connection. I love that they were so creative and inventive together. I love how I started with Wild Things Run Fast, which is where she met him. And if you watch the videos from that album, they're so cute. I kind of just like got caught up in their romance. So I was interested in that. And I was interested in it as a working relationship, and I really and I came to discover what is easy to discover, which is that he was, here she's with this younger guy who's, from a jazz background, but maybe a little more up on what's happening in this, in the new music or whatever, very connected to certain English artists in particular, Peter Gabriel, Thomas Dolby, Tears for Fears. That was another big influence on them at the time. And just really she had always been interested in synthesizers and in using tape loops, and did that, throughout her career. But that partnership, that connection with Larry kind of helped her walk more firmly into that area. And the Fairlight, they got a Fairlight, which any Kate Bush fans out there know is like the holy grail of early 80s synths. And just the way that they were using these new tools, I think was really just exciting to me. And that shift happened at the same time she was shifting her perspective as a lyricist as well. And I think when people, the struggles people have had with Dog Eat Dog in particular, has to do with not only the sound, which some people have felt sounds dated now, although all of those analog synth sounds are back now. So I think that's one reason why it's a good time to revisit this work, but also kind of alienated by what people view as her maybe simplistic politics or over preachy politics or something. But I think she was, assuming this oracular voice, and that's how others have talked about it. I talk about it, and really trying to make political music. And some of it is so powerful, I think. And then on Chalkmark and a Rainstorm, when she gets into creating these characters and making these little movies, I just think it's just fascinating the turns she took, and if it did produce the occasional dancing clown, definitely, I think we can all just agree as a group, probably Joni's worst song. Anyone want to redeem it? Argue with me, and argue with me in the Q&A. But it also produced so many amazing songs and so many bold moves. A song like Ethiopia, where she takes on the charity single as a phenomenon, and really brutally eviscerates her peers. Pretty amazing.
Okay, my turn, I guess. And I'm conscious of the fact that there's going to be people who want to ask. It'll be a lively Q&A, I'm sure. So I'll get this one out quick, and then maybe we
Okay.
can. I don't know, Carl. You can do what you think is right, since you're sort of the boss here. I just thought we should talk a little bit about speaking of moving forward chronologically. You know, the current Joni, that is
Right.
Joni Mitchell. Maybe post Brandy Carlisle, post aneurysm. You know,
Yeah.
she's had health struggles. She's now an elder, as it were. You know, one thing that I think is really admirable about your book is it's a demystifying book. It's not worshipful, but we're now in a phase of Joni Mitchell, of kind of pop, of reignited, you know, worship or whatever. There's a new Joni deification happening.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you know, when you and Carl and I were kind of spieling a little bit a few days ago about this talk, we were thinking about Joni's current phase, the kind of Lion in Winter phase, and how that
Yeah.
has
said.
worked for other artists, male artists in particular. We talked a little bit about Aretha's late phase, and you know what Joni was doing in relation to that.
Yeah.
Willie Nelson came up. Certainly late Sinatra came up, which I think is very salient when you think about that one incredible version of Both Sides Now that she
Right.
first recorded with that in the 90s, early 2000s, which, you know, very Sinatra Riddle-esque version, where suddenly the worldly wisdom of this older woman is brought to bear on this song she wrote as whatever, very, very young person.
Yeah.
Which kind of circumnavigates us back to your childhood chapter, because
Yeah.
you get into that song very interestingly in that chapter. So anyway, let's talk about the current Joni and Joni worship, and what it means that she's been, that so many people are, you know, rediscovering her work right now, and what she represents.
I mean, I try to place the current Joni in the context of the long arc of her building her legacy, which really begins when she offers up these greatest hits packages, hits and misses. And in that, by creating the misses record, which is like, here are my deep cuts. You have to deal with these. Like, you can have my hits, but you have to deal with the songs I like too. So she's from the very beginning of that was, you know, she never would do greatest hits packages, unlike everyone. She wouldn't do them. And so fighting against the being trapped in a legacy that wasn't of her own controlling, I think is sort of where she starts. And I think we see that, you know, even in the kind of early 2000s, when the tribute concerts start to happen, and then she does Walden Woods Benefit, which is a Don Henley thing where she sings with an orchestra, and she duets with Bjork. And then that led to the Travelogue Project, and to the other orchestral work she did with Larry Klein producing, where they are contextualizing. First she's doing covers, then she does her own songs, and she kind of recasts them in this other light and turns them into standards, right? So she's figuring out how to remove them from the baggage of the 60s and the 70s and stuff. But then she's also, even as she's doing that, she's also going all the way back to her roots, the music she grew up on, you know, which was her father's albums of jazz and ballads, and Joni James. I have this fantasy that Joni Mitchell listened to Joni James, who was, of course, like kind of a Connie Francis type. So I think she's like, you know, and she's filtering it all through jazz, of course, and so it's more of a, and her love of Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. So she's already, you know, in there and thinking about Annie Ross and all of that. So when she's building her legacy, she's creating a new Joni. She's creating a new character to inhabit. A lot of stuff and then the 90s happens, and she reunites with her birth daughter, her daughter, as you know, who she had entrusted in adoption. And so that also opens the door for her for Joni as mother, a role she was never comfortable with before then. And so that's Lilith Fair happens, and suddenly it's like, oh, well, this is mother. But but then she also is still rejecting that a bit in the 90s. And I think what we've seen is a slow turn toward her acceptance of that role of a matriarchal and now a grandmother figure. And that's kind of where she is now. But I also think we should always examine like our desire to place women in that role. Like, why why do we have to make all elder women into mothers? Like, we could ask the same question about Stevie Nicks, like, why does an older woman have to be a mother? So I don't know. I think as far as it relates to Joni now, one of the wonderful things about how she presents herself at the Joni Jam is she hi guys, can you see me? Sorry,
Yeah.
my internet, we're having one of our wonderful patented storms here and my internet just went out. But I'm on my phone now, so hopefully it will continue. It will be okay. Anyway, that's what I was saying. It's like I think she's inhabiting the role of elder with a certain kind of trickster playfulness that I love about her that I think is always there.
Yeah, I obviously now's the time to open it up to questions, but one thing that'll come up, which I know we discussed in our little convo a couple days ago, was just one of the things I love about those recent performances is just hearing what she's doing vocally and how she's using what wasn't a kind of virtuosic instrument in a different way, in that way that, speaking of late Sinatra, great vocal stylists do when they maybe lose a little off their fastball, but then they start working the breaking stuff. So there's definitely much more to say about Joni's musicianship that you get into in the book that we haven't touched on yet, but let's get to questions. Carl, is that your department?
Yes. As
Yeah,
we're doing
I agree.
that, let me quickly check and make sure, because my dear friend Josh, I see, just asked in the chat, should I be seeking shelter? I do need to see if we're under a tornado warning.
Drama.
Love living in Nashville. I don't think we are, though. I think it's just a thunderstorm, but give me 1 second. No, just a thunderstorm. We're good. Let's proceed.
Well, and instead we can have a tornado's worth of questions.
Tornadoes worth of questions. Knock me over. All right, who's up
Antonia, I think you're facilitating.
Yes, I'm up for the questions. Let's see. There are a lot of great comments in the chat. But I think the first question might be from Gus. Let's see.
Could be.
Could be.
Well, I think mine got kind of knocked down because of a reply, but there's one from, oh, wait, maybe not. Well, should I just go ahead?
Yeah, but
Yeah, go for
Okay.
it, Gus.
Hi.
Hi. It's nice
This
to
is
see
so
you.
exciting. I'm just dying to read the book. I've been anticipating it for, well, I mean, years, I guess now. So it's just wonderful to see it in the world.
Well, I think it should sit on the shelf next to your Woody Guthrie book. So
Well,
thank you for your book.
thank
too.
you. And that's kind of related to what I wanted to ask you about. Kind of what I wanted to ask you about is just like your relationship, your personal relationship with Joni Mitchell over time. Are you like a super fan?
Yeah.
Did this book change, did writing the book change your relationship to her? And I guess like the kind of more like writerly side of that is just from my own experience of writing about Woody Guthrie and writing about this really major figure who actually wasn't a major fan of.
Right.
But I came to see like a version of him that I was fascinated by and like really interested in and kind of like loved in some ways. And I'm wondering if that,
That's
I don't know, I'd just
100%
be
what
curious to see
happened.
yeah, did
Yeah,
something,
that's
anything
100%
like
what
that
happened.
happen? Or do you
Yeah,
have to
no,
love your
completely.
topic to some extent in some way?
It's a great question, and in fact, in the introduction, I talk about this immediately and talk about how when I started the book, this book was brought to me. Denise Oswald, who was then at Dey Street, was like, "I want to read you on Joni," and I was like, "Okay, what?" I kind of like decided I would do it, and then I was immediately freaked out. It was like, "What in God's name have I done?" And I remember having a conversation with Gail Wald, in which I was like crying in my martini, being like, "What have I done? Why am I doing this book? I can't relate to her. She's too beautiful. She's too regal. She's too much of a genius. Everyone loves her. I want to write a book on the Roaches. I want to write a book on someone nobody knows or whatever." And I went through that, and that was really hard. But then I read a couple of books. One was Jeff Dyer's book, Out of Sheer Rage, about D.H. Lawrence, and such a great book. And then another was this book by Dorian Nigriofa called Ghost in the Throat. It's a very different kind of book about a 17th century Irish poet that she got fascinated with. And both of those books kind of gave me permission to foreground my struggle. So that's in the book. That memoir elements are in the book and run throughout. But then once I broke through that, and also I felt so much pressure to live up to an idea of biography that I see Holly George Warren is here, and that some of our friends so beautifully realize, like the beautiful, thick, like definitive biography. I was like, I can't, just like, that's not my thing. I just am not good at that kind of writing, I think. So then I had to, I did all the standard kind of like, read the Janet Malcolm, Sylvia Plath book and whatever, went through that. Also found the writing of Hermione Lee very helpful on this subject. She's written some amazing essays on biography that helped me think through what biography can and can't accomplish. So yeah, I kind of needed like that. I needed a little support from others saying what you're doing is okay. Then as I got it, that just let me in the door. And then once I got in the door, I mean, it's similar to you guys probably. Once I started spending time with the work and cleared away the aura a bit, then I just got so immersed, And I also wanted, I think I have a compulsion to argue against received wisdom that has served me well in my career, but at times is not appropriate. And I really didn't want to be like, Joni's the greatest. I wanted to resist that. I wanted to say, and again, those early drafts, like so much of it was writing about everything but Joni. Like, okay, you want me to write about Joni, I'm going to write about Roberta Flack, whatever. And I'm glad I actually ended up writing an essay about Roberta Flack that I'm very proud of. But the point is, I was like, anything but. So I had to like work my way through that ridiculous emotional crisis I was having. And then as I just spent time with the work, I could see step by step how her work builds. And then by the end of it, you're like, well, she is the great. What can you do? She is the greatest, whatever. She's certainly, in my opinion, the greatest lyricist. I would definitely put her next to Dylan and Cohen her favorite people to cite, her pace setters, as she calls them. If nothing else, for the lyrics, I think she deserves every accolade. But and then I also I don't know, I really enjoyed the sides of her that were more prickly and vulnerable and difficult, and I came to value that. So the Joni that herself is constantly expressing her anxiety and her insecurity and her awkwardness and things I couldn't imagine that the legend doesn't contain, but the work, it's there in the work.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Steve Waxman.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Anne. Yeah, I am asking what I said is a very on-brand question for myself about Joni as guitarist, and wondering to what extent you engage with that side of her musicianship. You just said you would totally put her up in the highest echelons of lyricists, which I think, yes, obviously. But it's been striking to me how, I mean, she was always an amazing musician, but it's striking how much her musicianship has become a lot more of a focal point. Like, I just double checked to verify my memory on the most recent Rolling Stone 250 greatest guitarists. She's at number 9.
Right, which is amazing, right?
I mean, the fact that Sister Rosetta is actually at number 6 is maybe even more amazing. But either way, like, having women in those lists is not something that's been that common. And her specifically, because of the unique character of her guitar playing.
Right.
But also I thought that her musicianship has some really important connections to what you were describing earlier about your engagement with her as a jazz artist, or engagement with jazz, and the way that virtuosity is so much a part of jazz musicianship and jazz discourse. So I'm wondering how much that enters into the way that you've handled her and treated her and commented on her work.
Yeah, I mean, actually the kind of reverence for her tuning methods and her guitar style that evolved out of her open tunings. I was suspicious of that at first, to be honest, and I'd love to hear your opinion of it, but I think it's completely undeniable that was hugely influential on everyone around her. And I discovered that more as I talked to people. I mean, and not even just talk to people, but like read up on the literature, and Graham Nash stealing one of her borrowing whatever, paying homage to one of her on Lady of the Island. I mean, literally picking up her guitar that was tuned a certain way and writing a song in that tuning. So things like that, Eric Clapton, there's a famous photo of him staring at her, trying to figure out how she was playing those tunings. So I was suspicious of it, though, because I knew that those tunings had been used by blues players and were used by people like Richie Havens, and she also always has said that Elizabeth Cotton's style of playing was hugely influential on her. So again, I wondered if this white woman had been granted this unique status that actually had been put, she had culled together from various people, various Black artists, various blues artists. I think it's somewhere. I mean, I think she did invent her own thing, and also because partly it was because of her weakness in her hand from polio. So it was, I love that aspect of Joni's musicianship, which you see over and over again throughout her career. The practical problem solving, let's solve a problem, let's solve a puzzle. We have a puzzle. Later in life, she had a special guitar / synthesizer designed for her so she could play after she had post-polio syndrome. And that's what you hear on Taming the Tiger. And so I think, I like the way her musicianship is never showy. It's always in the service of the song, but also just in the service of solving a problem, and her curiosity about music. And then I also do think the guitar playing kind of overshadows other aspects of her musicianship, particularly her skills as a band leader in the 70s and into the 80s, and how she was able to, and in the studio and as a producer, and how she was able to bring all these different people together to create a sound that was perfect for her work. And then obviously I talk about this in the 80s chapter, her innovation and exploration of using synthesizers and other different studio tools. I think we focus on the guitar in a weird way because we, and I'm using a broad we, because the music critic industry or whatever wants to elevate women in a certain way. Oh, let's call her a great guitarist. But in a weird way, I think that is reductive about her musicianship. Also, her vocal, the way she has changed her singing style so many times throughout her life, and what she did, how she found a style of singing that was indebted to jazz singing but wasn't jazz singing, things like that. So I guess the question to ask is, why do we want her to be a guitar hero more than the kind of holistic music hero that she actually is? And I wish I'd thought of that before just now, Steve Waxman, because I would have put that in my book. That's why I needed to have the session before I published my book.
Oh, thanks, Anne. That was great.
And I think the next question is actually my question. And I said I became interested in Joni Mitchell because Prince mentions her in The Ballad of Dorothy Parker, and that my listening world wouldn't have overlapped with her otherwise. Are there popular musicians that are influenced by Joni that might not seem obvious to casual listeners?
Oh yeah, I think actually Miles pointed this out to me, Miles Greer, that in the 80s, same time as Prince did it, but even a little later, a lot of R&B musicians started to cite Joni. And famously Janet Jackson, of course, with her song "God Till It's Gone," incorporating Big Yellow Taxi, but she became kind of a cool artist to cite for those musicians who maybe were like trying to, and again, I'm quoting Miles here, but the boundaries or challenge the boundaries of R&B. So I think, she's always been, and of course, we all know this, but here's to our beloved Greg Tate, always a great champion of Joni, in complicated ways, but definitely connecting what Joni did and does to R&B. So, but it's really hard to find any corner of music where someone doesn't cite Joni, she's who, like, I know, oh, is it Metallica, or there's still like a heavy metal band or something where it's so obvious. Led Zeppelin, obviously. Robert Plant supposedly wrote "Going to California" about Joni. So that would have been, had they actually collaborated, that would have been amazing, but they didn't. But I think she is, and again, this might be one reason why I felt a little resistant to her initially. Like, she's such the go-to for so many people when they talk about excellence, that it's almost it's a little bit exhausting. But I think it's because she has this like multiplicity of well, it's just like her excellence is multiple. So she touches different people in different ways. So
thank you for that. Going to California is one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs, so that is a interesting connection there.
Yeah, there you go.
Next up, we have Krista Bentley.
Oh, sorry, let me unmute. Hi, Anne. So excited to
Krista.
do this. I was curious about what it was like to talk to people about Joni Mitchell, people in her orbit. When I was doing my dissertation research, I noticed a lot of hesitation kind of to talk about her. I think she was in a more reclusive or solitary period, and
Yes,
they were kind of hesitant to go on the record about her. A bunch of people would say, please don't put that in the book. I don't want that to get back to her. So
yeah. Well, anyway, first I want to say I'm excited for your work too, and I'm excited about your work. So yeah, I found the same thing. I mean, I did a bunch of interviews for the book with some of the more famous names at the Joni 75 tribute. So they were already in Joni worship mode, you know. I mean, that's where I talked to Graham Nash and James Taylor and David Crosby. I talked to when he played the Tiny Desk, and at the end of his life, he was in full on, you know, atonement mode, and just wanted to say, make up for anything he might have said that wasn't completely complimentary. So, you know, I found that a lot with a lot of the older men in her circle. But there was, no, I mean, I don't know if I ever, I mean, I definitely got people who were like, I don't think I want to talk to you unless, you know, Joni knows about this, right? And she did know about the project. There was no way she couldn't know about it. So, but I didn't talk to Joni, so there was some hesitancy. There's only one person, and I will not name them, who refused to talk to me because Joni wasn't talking to me or whatever. But in general, I think I don't know. I don't know what would have happened had I been asking some of those harder questions, though. You know, if I'd actually come out and been like, and said, you know, well, what did you think, Mark? You know, and that's my sort of failure of courage, I guess, to not ask those questions directly of those people. And I don't think anyone's ever asked those questions. There is a kind of a way, and it's interesting to hear you say you experienced it too, where people are afraid of her. They are afraid of her, you know. But I have found that that's less true since the aneurysm too. Like,
Yeah, I was kind of curious. It feels like she has a lot more people around her right now.
she does, and I think she's just in a different space, as they say. As they say in Los Angeles, she's just in a different headspace. So yeah, but no, for sure. She's still. I mean, I imagine it's really not any different than Dylan. You know, she's an edifice. She's a mountain, and even those who are close to her know that she is. Or my power is going out again, guys. So anyway, I think my power actually did go out. So anyway.
I think that's a
All
great
right.
response, and I'll let people go
Thank
on to other questions while we still have you on the line.
Yeah, my power definitely just went out with that. Anyway, luckily I'm attached to my phone, so.
Should we keep going in or?
Yeah, we can. My power went out, but my computer's still working for now. So why don't we just keep going for a moment? Oh, it's back. Life in the South, you know what I mean?
Okay. I think I skipped a question by Matthew Jones. Still here?
Oh, I'm here.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I
I'm
feel like
so-
our work so often parallels.
It does. We're kind of always sort of like kind of one step around each other. I'm just back up really quick. I can't remember what I was rambling about when I tried to ask. And to me, if you see it
Yeah,
fast.
it was about fans of Joni.
Yes.
Fan boards.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking about your book and the way that it is going to be received, since it is this kind of like demystifying project, the way it's going to be received or thoughts you might have about this among the fan communities that are so resistant to anything that doesn't just reiterate Joni's sort of place on the pedestal or in the pantheon or whatever. And I think talking about Art Nouveau and the kind of like blackface era is sort of what spurred this thought for me. But I've spent a lot of time in those kind of digital spaces, especially like the social media groups, where anything critical is just attacked.
Yeah,
I'm
I know.
wondering, you know, kind of what your thoughts are about that side of, I guess, Joni fandom.
Well, to be honest, I saw you posting something about that, and I definitely had a moment of like, oh shit. Because I know you brought up, like, didn't you bring up Art Nouveau in a fan forum, and people were freaking out on you?
People really, they will go out of their way to defend her blackface and her brown face. and they will get really nasty, you know, with the
Yeah.
person kind of like raising the criticism. And so it's just an interesting thing that you're writing this book that I think a lot of those folks are going to read.
Yeah, well,
I'm-
it's being, yeah, there's even a giveaway on the jonimitchell.com site.
Yeah.
I will say that the people who are kind of behind Joni, the Joni industry right now, sorry, BB got on her plane, so it's all good. Anyway, they all seem to like it so far, so that's good. Les Irwin has been really receptive and nice, and who runs the jonimitchell.com site, and the folks at Rhino have been really nice, so that makes me feel good. You know, and I know Brandy's read it and she feels good about it. So, but that said, who knows? I mean, you know, who knows? And who knows what happens? This is also another thing about having a living subject. Like she could come out with a statement where she's like, I hate this book, and that would not be great for the book, you know. But hopefully that won't happen. But I don't know, it's complicated. I guess I'd love to hear from anyone about this. Like, you know, if you have a living subject, how much do you even concern yourself with that? Because I think when you concern yourself too much with that, it becomes it just distorts the work, and it becomes, you know, it lessens your own work. So I didn't really see any other and by the way, Daphne, I see your comments and I totally agree. It's like that is not exclusive to Joni for people to make excuses for transgressions of this kind, for sure. It's yeah, but that's sort of what I try to say, you know, in the chapter. Is just like I try to kind of do a processing where it's like, oh, am I making excuses? Am I making excuses? And constantly like ask myself, because I do think that's like a default for white people to kind of contextualize, no, it was the times. And I really wanted to fight against that. So
Awesome.
I don't know, but who knows? I hope they don't dox me or blow up my house or something. That doesn't seem like the way Joni fans would act, though. They'll be mad, but whatever. I don't know. But the other thing is, like, it's 2024. How can we not talk about it, you know? And it shouldn't have to be 2024 to make it possible, but it just seemed like completely impossible to not really like say more than a few sentences, which is what most people say. So how are you going to deal with it in your work?
You know, I've been thinking about the exact issue of the Don Juan's cover. I have the record store poster of Don Juan hanging above my desk. So every time I see this kind of blackface Joni Mitchell looking at me. And I think her decision to change that artwork is really kind of fascinating, because she's been so reticent about all of that for so many years now.
It's so true.
You know, and so that's the big question that I've been, is just what does it mean that she does this but doesn't draw any attention to it?
It's very interesting, isn't it?
And I'm thinking,
you have this advantage because that happened after my galleys were out, so you get to write about that.
And I'm also thinking about the people, and then I'll be quiet. I'm thinking about the people that she does have around her now, like the influence of, like, during the pandemic, of having Brandi Carlile and Charlie Puth and this younger generation of musicians who are maybe more inclined to say
Allison
no.
Russell.
Yeah.
Allison Russell. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I hope you're right about that. Yeah. We'll see.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I skipped over people. Apologies, because Larry Whitselden had a question.
Oh, hi. And I really enjoyed the excerpt that was in Washington Post. And I'm jealous. I'm jealous of all the other people who've had a chance to read it already. I guess I had a question. I'm interested in your approach where you talk about kind of keeping a critical distance. And I'm an ethnomusicologist. So I've been thinking about that because I've been watching the Soulsville HBO documentary, which is based on Rob Bowman's book. And that's very different because he's talking about a whole cluster of people rather than individual. But I guess it's a a whole different approach, kind of based on, kind of getting to know the people rather than
Right.
keeping, is distance the right word? I guess, just could you say something about that? The way you
Yeah.
approach this,
Yeah, I thank you
objectivity, maybe.
Well, thank you for that question. And thank you for framing it in that way, because a lot of people have been asking, well, why didn't you talk to Joni? And I address that in the book, and I talk about not wanting to get sucked into the vortex of her charisma. But I did also talk to so many people around her. So it's not like I, completely kept my distance or whatever. So I think, first of all, what you're describing with Rob's book, I feel like that is the art of biography, or a certain kind of a style of doing social history that I admire so much, but it's not necessarily what I think is my strength as a thinker and a writer. So I wanted to have room for what I think I do best. So, in that way, keeping a little bit of distance served me, just in terms of from just my own comfort and what I think I'm good at. But I also, well, two things. One, it's very difficult. I wanted to stay away from the idea of an official story or one story about her. And so once a person has told you their story, it's very difficult to not accept that or not present that as an official story. If I was to tell you my story, it would be weird for you to be like, well, that's only one side of the story. But in fact, I do believe that even when someone tells us their story, it's partly fictional. It's memory is faulty. We're always self-mythologizing, all that stuff. So that was, something that I didn't want the complication of having this central official story that then I would have to either be somehow refuting, which is almost impossible to do. And then also, I liked the way in which having her be slightly in the distance from me, like I like the kind of metaphor or the writing practice of that, to have her always be ahead of me on the trail, as it were, and so that's kind of a literary reason, I guess, was like I didn't want to pretend that I had nailed her or ever knew exactly what she was, so that would have been another reason for it.
Could I ask you just another very quick question?
Yes,
Thank you very much for that. In the process of like listening and thinking and talking about her work while you're doing this, did you change your evaluations of any things that you liked more, you liked less, or you felt that you'd neglected, or that anything changed about the way you listened to her music?
Yeah, definitely a lot changed. I think that I just came to appreciate the subtleties of what she was doing a lot more. I don't know, like I said before, I wasn't a huge fan of the 80s stuff, and I became a completely devoted fan of the 80s stuff. I also think for me, when I'm writing in general, it's that immersion into a period or work or scene that then allows me to form my new perceptions of it. So that really happened with every period in its own way. I think I came out of it being much more interested in her later work than in her very early work, but I still have to admit, like the Blue to Mingus period is like, that's still canon, that's still in my mind probably what I return to the most, as much as I love the other stuff. So that part of it didn't change, but even, I don't know, if someone asks me like, what's your favorite Joni record now, that answer will change, from week to week. It's no longer always Hijira, which it probably was for most of my life leading up to working on this book.
Thank you so much.
Right now, I think I'm really fixated on Night Ride Home. Thanks for that question. Thank you so much.
Chris Maleffy?
Hey, Ann, can you
Hi,
all hear me?
Chris.
Hi,
Yes, I'm in the dark, but I can still hear you.
good to know. Hang in there. Um,
Thanks.
I had a bajillion questions in my head, but I'll just ask this one. Do you think the Joni of today, the one who's like making peace with her legacy and recasting it in her own preferred idiom, would embrace the Lilith image of Joni? And I'm thinking of how in every Lilith Fair show, at least in that first year in '97, they would close with a big sing-along on Big Yellow Taxi led by Sarah
Yeah.
McLachlan and everything.
Yeah.
Is Joni at peace with this whole campfire jamboree side of her image? Because I can't tell if she likes that or disdains it, or I got the sense in the 90s that she wanted absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the whole Lilith thing, but I would love your impressions. If you're still there. Did we lose Ann?
Hmm.
Ann, can you hear us?
She might be logging back in if she got kicked
Okay,
off,
fingers
but
crossed. All right, we'll hang in there.
give it a sec anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, it's funny, that impression from the 90s, Chris. I wish I had taped them. There was like a series of CBC radio interviews that I remember from her around that time and in the early 2000s, where any time that she was asked about any younger woman musician, she would always be like, "Oh, they're crap. They just ripped me off." She was extremely harsh on people at the time.
Well, and there's this side of her catalog. I mean, like I once went to a Unitarian Universalist church service where the circle game was played almost as if it was a hymn. Like there's that side of Joni's legacy. And I don't know how comfortable she is with that. I don't know that she wants to be that person. Anyway.
I mean, one of the things that we talked about is that the Joni jams are like that, right? And so
right.
it's kind of shocking to see her in that context, given how much she seemed to not want to be in the past.
Right. Anyway,
well, maybe we're not getting Ann back,
which is a pity. I'm sorry that I'm the bad luck charm.
Jody's just texting her, I think, to double check.
Yeah, I haven't seen her reemerge on the entering the room.
Okay.
Well, maybe we have to wrap up there.
Yeah, I wonder if your phone ran out of battery or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris. But thanks to everybody for coming. It was great to have such a big crowd for our closing session here. And we'll see you in the fall, and submit proposals if you have books coming up.
Thanks so much for this wonderful series, you guys.